Hello everyone and welcome. This is a video, but it's not a true video, so like a YouTube reply to a fellow astrologer, to a better said, to a fellow student of astrology, because we are forever students of astrology. I'm not actually quite sure if there is an astrologer of humankind, of course, who can consider himself actually master astrologer. Why? Because the energies, their expressions, their nuances, what may manifest from the various range of their expressions and what is very unlikely depending on our moods, on our karmic path, collectively of course, and naturally individually, depending on what we have in our lives in the present, what we built, what have we built upon, etc., etc. So even the expressions of the energies, of course, change. And we can see this so very clearly in very big celestial conversations because those are very, very easy to document. One very recent and very powerful example is the meeting of Saturn and Pluto on the 12th of January 2020, a celestial conversation that in that position, of course, happens around every 518 years or so. So it was very easy to look back at how it happened in 15, 18, 20 or something like that, where that past conjunction of Pluto and Saturn coincided with the reformist movement where the Reformist Church broke away from the Catholic one. This is where Saturn, the authority, the head of everything, the head of earthly power, the Pope, the institution of the Pope, and Pluto, the imminent change and the truth that existed that could not further be denied, and that is that basically people everywhere reached sufficient openness and spiritual maturity and even intelligence, so to speak, to interpret the holy texts, respectively the Bible, for themselves and also in their native language, because this is what it kind of produced on a wider range, that it did make the sacred text be accessible even in a raw format, so to uninterpreted, to basically everyone in a larger sense, if you know what I mean. And that changed the world profoundly because the power dynamics were changed, because basically the very structures and foundations of a mainstream religion, of a very, very important religion, have been changed. And in 2020, we had the COVID and everything, every single side and nuance that it brought with it, that was basically the challenging force. And it did challenge authorities absolutely everywhere. And authorities, Saturn, were challenged not by just by people and our reaction, our moods, and the larger psychology, mass psychology of all that has happened. But at the same time, it was also external influences, the international relationships, and basically everything that doesn't depend all that much on the individual, no, solely. And it did transform our world, our lives, and our normality in a way where there is, without a shadow of a doubt, no going back. It transformed our value system, it transformed our way of thinking, Mercury also being part of that conjunction. It even transformed our diet and relationship with food and source of nurture, and this included psychological, financial, legal, because Jupiter was also in the sign of Capricorn at that time. So yes, how we perceive law and justice and fairness and equity and correctness and all of those series are kind of a nurture to the citizens that we are. Needless to say, the sun was also there, so it did impact the way we project our light, our thoughts, our anything that has to do with our identity onto others, the world, and basically the larger expression of Capricorn, the world, stage or the world, basically. Now, this was very necessary to explain that expressions of planets do transform over time because they are very, very correlated to the human element and even the dimension of emotion and basically polarized thought. Even basically, if we look at it this way, the gods, the celestial beings, the titans, the rulers, perhaps, the ruling energies, the guiding energies, the leadership of the ether, well, it was thought to be how they entered into the human sphere as such an elevated emotion, such a deep feeling that it manifested itself in a certain way. So, basically, even deities themselves are in a way dependent of the human element, so we can imagine that even expressions of the planets, which have also extraordinarily strong correlation with deities as they were perceived by the ancients, everything basically transforms, it changes, it evolves, it will adapt to the needs of the now. But of course, there is a certain part of the symbolism which is usually rooted in ancient wisdom, ancient knowledge, and ancient tradition. Some elements are always the same because it's their very foundation, their very core. Now, long story short, in this recording, I would like to speak about Saturn because how to understand Saturn in different contexts, because the fellow astrology student asked me this question, how to better understand Saturn. So yes, the theme of this recording is actually Saturn and how to basically work with it in a more philosophic sense. Because in a rather non-philosophic sense, there has been a lot of work done, a lot of knowledge, especially modern one, the realm of psychology, Carl Jung, where, of course, Saturn was stripped from its let's say, supernatural and more occult elements, and it was presented as basically our inner structure, where basically, like it or not, and regardless of our psychological configuration, all of us have to ensure our own survival, our own stability, our place on the earth, in matter, in society, where we need to be. It is Saturn where we work. Life is also about constant, non-stop work. Now, of course, let's not understand work in the very telluric sense, but as in job or something like that, even that, though that is perfectly included, but it is basically what do we produce, what do we make, what do we build within through our being. So as you can see, this includes basically all of life. What do we do with life? What do we do with our existence? There are parts which are more optional, but there are parts where us providing our own survival, us providing our own structure, stability, including psychologically, and yes, even spiritually, or for some people, it goes hand in hand with morality, while for other people, it can only be morality and not really anything deeper. And there's no problem at all, because that is also in a way Saturn. Saturn mixed with other energies, of course, but Saturn is what we do with our morality, our moral structures, our moral limitations, the lack of limitations, and naturally what we do, how we sanctify, what we dedicate our lives to. And there are more, let's say, typical Saturnian expressions where someone answers a soul calling, a career, a profession, a role even, mother, father, any kind of role with great dedication, and they kind of become it. But there are, of course, more non-conventional expressions of Saturn, because ultimately Saturn is the co-ruler, ancient ruler of Aquarius, which even under Saturn's rule is unique, extraordinary, individualistic, extremely authentic. So even Saturn, on his own terms, space, and methodologies, has to have a rather Uranian side when needed, because that is also part of evolution. Reward. Saturn can also be seen as reward system. The larger scale of action and reaction and the laws that govern it. Certain laws which limit it, others which catalyze it. That is also very much under the rulership of Saturn, and even physically, because Saturn, the laws of nature, Newtonian laws, and quite frankly, Saturn, especially in more ancient takes in astrology, was a deity, a force, a power, very much linked to agriculture itself. The site of Saturn, the sickle, harvest, the plants have their very, very fixed, mostly, cycles, Saturn fixed, where usually the typical example, there is the seed, it sprouts, there has to come the springtime and then the summertime, the flower opens, bees, wind, the other elements, and then the cycle kind of repeats. So that is extremely Saturnian, and very, very rarely does anything stray from those fixed, stabilized, crystallized cycles. So of course Saturn was a force which represented harvest, the moment of harvest, ripening, when something is complete, when something is ripe, but naturally ignore the rules of the cycles, and of course Saturn has to take on the other expressions that are correlated ultimately to harvest, the spoils, or when before harvest there was not enough work done, or there was disruption, and it will naturally equal scarcity, bad harvest, poverty, sometimes, why not, the extinction of the species. That is also very Saturnian, when Saturn breaks down, when Saturn has to give way to the cause and effect. So, and naturally, in an elevated example, quantum physics. Now, the rules there are kind of, let's say, ever-changing and highly subjective, but that is also Saturn, because in the moment when, even if there's a millisecond stability, there you go, there's Saturn. Now, of course, in modern times, Saturn is also correlated with so very many proper examples, like, how should I say, concrete elements, buildings, big structures, bones, teeth, anything that sits on the ground, anything that towers, anything that holds a certain kind of longevity, stability, like mountains themselves. So everything physical that has at least a Saturnian quality provides a base, a structure. It supports something for long term in the physical. That is also Saturnian. May that be a part, a component, let's say even a country. Why not? There can be so very many quite concrete and physical Saturnian expressions, especially that Saturn governs and rules everything that physical. Now there comes the rather psychological. Any type and form of leadership, a hierarchy, very fixed roles, like for example within a family, son, daughter, brother, sister, mother, father, all of this, the structure itself is Saturnian, and the tradition and custom, which also goes hand in hand with it, is also Saturnian, because that's the, let's say, work of many, many, many previous generations, so of course you respect it as well. Yet, that is not alien, so to speak, to change, to transformation, readaptation, so even that is not necessarily a problem. Anything that has to do with teachers, with learning, reward systems, even justice, but in a sense where it's already executory. So not where it's in the philosophical courts of justice, the judge and lawyers and all of that, where it's already in execution, like enforced. Law enforcement is very Saturnian. Militaristic things are, one might think Mars, yes, the action is Mars, but the methodology, the tools, the execution is quite, Saturnian, because that will present the technology, the weapons, the tactics. Saturn in the sign of Aquarius, the ancient ruling, all about how we use intelligence to solve problems and get what we want. Saturn is naturally also getting what we want, the bigger reward. And, when it comes to teaching and school and tutorship scholar, when the student graduates, the reward, or when the student fails, another type of reward. So that is a more modern way to look at Saturn, because we look at its energy, we look at its function, we look at what it does, so we can very easily identify the Saturn in anything. Like the human body, everything that is more very, very solid, like bones, like teeth, like, hard elements in the body. And naturally, going back to psychology, Saturn also in more modern times represents the father figure, the patriarchal figure, the sometimes even big brother who acts like a father, the military person who you can rely upon, the elderly male who gives good advice, the priest, for example, a person in authority who usually helps. Now, of course, this will have a negative effect. Who bullies you, who subjugates you, who traumatizes you, who abandons you, who is cruel. Yes, there is that side of it, absolutely. But is that not just a different form of the lesson? The absence of another Saturn means that your own is gonna be that much more amplified. Saturn also has to do with inner decision-making processes, inner mental functions, choice-making functions, because Saturn is it worth it? May that be anything. Your time, your energy, your attention, your physical work, your money, your sexual energies, anything. Is it worth it? Of course, this is also Venusian, but the final decision ultimately belongs to Saturn, because that is when your option, your choice usually crystallizes and you will execute it. You will already enforce your own laws. That is Saturn, also Saturn. Generosity, how much we give, how much we think we deserve. Well, yes, that is also Venusian, but when it becomes concrete, as in the check, the sum, the gesture, the hug, the cuddle, whatever, that is Saturnian. That is what Venus will subject once again to analysis. Because Venus will look at how concrete, how Saturnian what she deserved was. And if it was very okay, let's say, very, very positively Saturnian, she's gonna be ultimately satisfied, and why not want more? As I said, regardless of what this is, reward system. May this be in a job, anything. But would she find that it's not up to her expectations or what she thought she deserved, what she felt she deserved? She will take other type of, she will conjure up other types of emotions. Perhaps this is the best way to express it. So of course, Saturn has to collaborate through aspects or through synergies with other planets, and of course the signs that will kind of tell us how comfortable, uncomfortable Saturn is. Saturn usually very personally also has to do with someone's longer term health tendencies. If Saturn is aggressed by Uranus, by Mars, by other volatile energies, well, there will be disruptions, there might be accidents, there might be moments of frail health. When Saturn, for example, is extremely weakened or pushed into a corner, like truly aggressed, for example, by Pluto, or that means frail health most of the time, but it doesn't need to be fatality or anything, just the person will have to put extra work into self-care and taking care of the physical body. Or mental health, why not? Or emotionally vulnerable, or have a big dysfunction, a Saturnian big dysfunction, not able to give, not able to receive, have a very, very strong blockage within that cannot easily be removed, permanent financial troubles because of a psychological. All of these can have a lot to do with Saturn as well. One's relationship with the father. Saturn also tells us that. Saturn's relationship with the moon. One's tendency to know what kind of parent they're gonna become. Their how should I express this? Tendencies psychologically, emotionally, and as action, reaction, and instinct when they get into parental roles. Like helping the weaker colleague. That's all. You're a father or mother there. Not per se, but the energy that you generate and the inner function. You are a parent to that colleague, to the pupil, to the vulnerable person, to the younger person, etc. So, or when you show a colleague something, you train someone, officially or not officially, the neighbor comes to you, please show me how to do that. You're still already embodying the Saturnian trait here. So, Saturn activates quite strongly and deeply in our lives. And this is exactly the reason why a more modern take on Saturn, I do believe, is more helpful, more closer to our collective psychology, to the moment. Because the more ancient take on Saturn, and especially in medieval times, and medieval alchemists, for example, had quite a radical view of Saturn. And this is where we need to understand, first of all, the mythology. Because Uranus preceded Saturn, and Uranus, according to what version of the legends and mythology we listen to, united with Gaia, of course, but sometimes violently. Sometimes he kind of raped her, and naturally she liked to visit her, Uranus being Titan, god of the sky, Gaia the earth. He visited her quite a lot, and from their visitations, their communion, children were born, some quite monstrous, some quite powerful. Saturn was, of course, a child like this. But where Gaia represented the female element who wanted to nurture and raise and, like any mother, her children, Uranus saw the other truth, because Uranus ultimately is the objective truth and the great awareness of even the future, where one can know the future by making certain calculations. So the planet of astrology, Uranus, and anticipating the future. Uranus very easily saw how some of his children are way too monstrous and they need to be kept, let's say, hidden, while other children are extremely powerful, forceful, and they bring something totally new to the table of creation, to the kingdom, so to speak. Saturn being one of them, so naturally, Saturn had to succeed Uranus. Why? Because he needed to bring the golden age, where Uranus was violent, unpredictable, random, chaotic, spontaneous, raped Gaia, regardless of how, even if it was consensual, the children, well, so what's up with the children? You know, you can't really harass a mother's children like that, so something needed to be done. So naturally, Saturn created Venus as well from Uranus's testicles, and love became both rebellious. You're born from Uranus, free, uncontrollable. Love doesn't listen to anything. But love's father is also Saturn. So love has to be ennobled, disciplined, contained, and made sure that the chaotic nature of her doesn't produce bad Saturnian expressions. And this is where we get to the more occult side of Saturn, where naturally it was seen as a great malefic. Saturn's energy is of restriction, condensation, matter. Matter is condensed spirit, condensed energy. So Saturn needs to keep it condensed. But not everything that is in spirit may enter matter, because that which is unworthy, imperfect, not ripe, immature, way too chaotic, disturbed, or why not evil, cannot enter here to destabilize everything. And as I said, Saturn brought the golden age. That means great stability, where Uranus doesn't do what he wants. No planet does what they want. Everyone has to respect the sacred rules. Sacred rules which are, of course, limitative to lesser beings, greatly limitative to lesser beings. So we see why Jupiter also had to succeed Saturn in order to create stability between Uranus and Saturn, the past and the future, the chaos and self-defeating stability. And like Saturn's more cruel expression, this is where we get to it, when the story cannot have a good happy ending, when mistakes are permanent, when something meets certain conditions, it has to go bad way. There is no way out of it. That would be way too unfair. So we see why Saturn's reign, and ultimately tough rule had to be broken, because there needs to be much greater balance than what Saturn could provide for everything. So, of course, the cruelty, the restrictions, accidents, when the story has a sad ending, when there is sacrifice which cannot be paid off, all of the malefic expressions, when evil is flourishing, when the predator triumphs in an excessive way, where there's tyranny, where there is oppression, where there is pain, disease, sickness, where there is unhappiness, eternal sorrow. That was also part of Saturn. But let's ask ourselves, why? There was polygamous relationships everywhere. And that means that diseases kind of spread quite fast. So, how evil is this really? Why do not we look at the more positive sides emotionally, on a soul level, romantically? Well, more people were satisfied than not. So basically, that was the positive expression of Saturn. The soul lived love in so very many ways, and they were satisfied, very satisfied. But that sometimes shortens life. The other side, bad side effect of great freedom in love, and we're speaking about ancient Greece and ancient Rome and the ancients, even ancient Babylon, even ancient Egypt, because all of those have influenced Ptolemaic astrology as well. But anyway, great freedom, well, children sometimes die. Why? Lack of hygiene or excessive pleasure, alcohol, substances, plants, spirituality's manifested expression where, well, kind of everyone has powers to cause harm and lust. And if a man wants a woman and she's pregnant, well, first the baby has to disappear and only then will he have chances. Polytheistic spirituality gives everyone any kind of power they desire. Rituals, and they work. Why? As long as it's in collective consciousness, Saturn, they work. The rules were respected, they work. So you can imagine that a lot of death conflict was created by spiritual power. And it can be the advisor of the king, the concubine of the king, the witch, the astrologer, the high priest. Conflict was created. Let's be honest with this. This was also part of Saturn. So of course, death swept everywhere. And of course, gladiators and slaves. And that's also Saturn. For some it's okay, for others it's not okay. Exactly Aquarius. The duality of it. So of course, very easily, Saturn was associated with everything that is kind of bad. Rebellion, ultimately, Saturn in Aquarius. When the slaves uprise, or when a lazy emperor, lazy king is overthrown by its own counselors. All of these are action and reaction. So Saturn very much had a very good example, and there comes the lower malefic. Mars. Of course, Saturn is militaristic action, and Mars triggers the wildfire. Let's conquer, let's this and that. Mars is also conflict. So we can very easily see why Saturn was the great malefic. Because Saturn, the result of your work. If your work was to cause conflict, to cause strife, to kill people, to eliminate the enemy, to force people to pay more tax, you get the result of your action. So, yes, when Saturn is very powerful, it empowers tyranny. Why not? But in medieval times, in alchemy, it had an even more cruel expression, where it was, let me explain it in a different way. Similar what we think of the expression of alcohol today. Or Pluto and Scorpio. Or Ixion, for example. Or Orcus, the planetoid Orcus. It was like the cruel old man. It was basically seen like the tool of the devil, spreading disease, spreading pain, darkness, the power of the anti-Christ, if this can even be used as an example, all through the world, and the pure evil, basically. Saturn was seen also as pure evil by medieval alchemists. But why? Again, why? Well, Saturn in the time of medieval alchemists was basically the institution of the Pope, the Church, the state, and the Church ruled the state. So, of course, it was highly strict, and witch hunts and trials and how the Crusaders fell and all of that. Well, you can imagine that their trials, and Saturn is the execution of the trial, remember, not necessarily the Jupiterian phase. They were cruel beyond what we can even imagine today. Medieval torture and cruelty, Saturn. So of course Saturn was associated with all of that because Saturn executes. Neptune and Jupiter are just dreams, hopes, without Saturn. Jupiter is the expansion, the optimism, the hope, the divine truth, the philosophy, the higher octave of even faith. When we understand faith, when we understand the Creator within ourselves, that's Jupiter. Yet, if you wanted to live this in matter, you need Saturn. So Saturn is the manifestation energy. And in order for manifestation to be meaningful, it needs to provide the stage, the structure, even the structure of the world, structure of society, structure of the spirit, structure of the human psyche, of the all of our bodies, the energetic one, the mental one, the emotional one, the physical one, the more divine one. So Saturn, of course, also has to do with the chakras. Why? Their alignment, their stability, because they are our energetic imprint, our energetic structure. If a chakra, for example, is not really operational, it can very quickly be incompatibility with life itself. So it's very, very important. So, long story short, long reply short, Saturn needs to be understood, first of all, philosophically, and why it is needed for everything to exist and coexist. And as a finishing thought, we must also look at Saturn